Hello lovely people, in this video we'll be talking about how to blow a speaker. Now if this title sounds a little bit clickbaity, it kinda is, but I think if you know how to break a thing, you will know how to fix it. But in regards to the speakers, we will know how to use them properly without being scared of blowing them. So in this video, we'll be talking about a few different things. However, this video is going to be orientated to beginners, and I'm going to be using very basic terms and at the same time address a few different topics that are floating around on the internet. For example, speakers taking more than rated power or speakers blowing because of clipping and all that sorts of stuff. In order to do that, I hope everybody is familiar with the construction of a typical speaker. This is a 3.5-inch wideband speaker. This is the second speaker that I ever bought in my life, and it was acting as my center channel in the Insignia. Now I will be sacrificing it because we'll be taking this speaker apart and we're gonna see the internal parts of it. So if we're gonna start with very basics, let's do that. A speaker is made of a few different parts, soft parts and everything else. We'll call soft parts everything that is basically moving. We have a surround in there, we have that orange thing which is called a spider, and inside there is a coil with a former. We will take this apart, so I'm going to show you in more detail. From the outside, we have a basket and we have a motor structure. Now, a lot of people call this just a magnet, but a magnet is just a magnet. It just attracts metal. However, when it acts for a specific purpose, especially for a speaker, we call it a motor because it kind of makes the speaker move. Now, here we have those two tabs, you know, this positive and negative, where you connect your speaker outputs of the amplifier, you put some voltage in there, put some current through it, and due to some laws of physics, magic with magnets, this speaker is moving. Oh, I just ripped it. This speaker is moving back and forth. Okay, so this is going to be even better for you to show. In the center, you see there, this metal thing is called a pole piece. This is basically this whole metal thing that goes through the magnet, and there you have a gap. Again, you will be able to see this better when I'm going to take it apart. Now, a speaker is making sound by moving, and what moves is all the soft parts. So in regards to blowing a speaker, how can we blow a speaker? There's actually two ways how you can blow a speaker. First way has to do with the suspension, and the second way has to do with the coil. I think we're going to start with the suspension because it's much easier to understand it. When you put voltage in the speaker, as I mentioned, it's moving back and forth. Now, the more voltage you put, the more it is moving back and forth. However, every mechanical system has its own limits. So the limit of the suspension is the spider and the surround, because these are the two things that are holding the speaker in place. So if you would put too much voltage, that is too much volume, too big of a signal, you can damage firstly either the spider, either the surround. Now, how do you damage it? A lot of times, due to stretching, the surround splits somewhere or separates from the cone. Probably you're going to see this more in subwoofers rather than mid-ranges and mid-bass. However, this example is applicable to all speaker types. Now, what makes the speaker move a lot? Low frequency content, because low frequencies will move the cone much more than higher frequencies. So for example, if you take this mid-range and you're going to play, I don't know, 40, 30 hertz through it, is gonna move quite a lot. In order to prevent that, you need to use a high-pass filter on your amplifier, DSP on the head unit. A lot of times people use incorrect crossovers, that is, they're crossing the drivers way too low because they want that extra bass from their 6.5s. However, they cannot handle that. They're not designed to do that. And if you play a lot of bass through a small speaker, something will give. And as I mentioned, most of the time it's gonna be either the surround, either the spider is gonna rip. Sometimes, due to poor construction or low quality parts or glue, it doesn't necessarily split the surround or the spider, but it can unglue. And sometimes what can happen is a corner of spider can lift from the basket, and when you play it, it basically slaps into the basket. Exactly the same can happen with the surround. How do you prevent that? First of all, use crossovers, and second of all, listen. If the speaker is complaining, if you hear distortion distortion, especially playing lower frequencies, that is a sign that your high pass filter is way too low and you need to either increase it, either reduce the volume. Obviously, everybody wants as much volume as possible, so in that case, just increase your high pass filter. If you're looking for information on how to set your crossovers, I have quite a few videos on my channel. Please look for those and you will find all the information that you need. So here we discuss the first option, how to blow your speaker. Play it very low and play it very loud, and you will damage your speaker eventually. Another thing that can happen mechanically is, depending on the speaker construction, because you can see here, it's kind of a blank plate, so nothing can get out. So if the speaker goes out like that, it can rip the surround, but if it goes in at the same time, what can happen, the coil can bump into the backplate, and people call that coil slap. So you can hear it as a very, very sharp crack. So you can see in this case the speaker doesn't let that happen, but again, depending on the speaker construction, it could hit the backplate before it actually runs out of excursion. Now exactly the same can happen the other way. So if it's gonna be pushed and nothing is gonna happen to the surround and the spider, the coil can get out of the magnetic gap and it can just stay like this outside. Okay, so we discussed the first one, which is mechanical. Now let's take this apart and let's talk about electrical stuff and the coil, because I need to show you. There we go. This is the speaker in all its glory. So here inside you can see this thing, which is called a coil, and this is nothing more than a piece of wire wrapped around in a coil. And when you connect these to the amplifier outputs, you will have voltage and current running through these wires. Every coil will have a few different parameters such as inductance and resistance. Resistance is on DC, but if we're talking about frequency dependent resistance, it's called impedance. Typically in car audio we have 4 ohm drivers which have 4 ohm nominal impedance, sometimes 2. In pro audio you can have 8 ohms, you can have single coils, you can have double coils, and so on and so on. So here we can see, if I'm going to show you from up close, that wire. Can you see how thin this wire is? These tinsel leads, they have to be a bit thicker because they're moving quite a lot and they have to handle a lot of movement without breaking. However, there's very, very thin wire. In regards to power handling, this speaker, it says 50 watts max. Now, what does it mean? On every speaker, on every box, you will have a power rating. You're gonna have an RMS power rating and you're gonna have max or peak power or whatever else. We will be talking about RMS power ratings because any other rating doesn't mean pretty much anything. So this speaker, it says 50 watts max, but it's probably gonna be like 20 or 30 watts RMS. So what does it mean that the speaker can handle 20 or 30 watts RMS? If we're gonna take Ohm's law, we know that power equals voltage times current. And we know that our amplifiers are voltage amplifiers. So if we set up our amplifier, our power level, so that it will output 20, or let's for example take 30 watts. So if we set our amplifier to output 30 watts, this speaker should handle that. The conditions would be that the speaker is playing a sine tone of a specific frequency. Now that frequency doesn't really matter as long as while playing that frequency the speaker doesn't go out of X max, that is, it's not gonna bottom out. So for example 1000 hertz, if you set 1000 hertz, you set it at 30 watts, this speaker should handle that power. Now what do we mean by handle? As I mentioned, this is a coil that has its own impedance or resistance. Resistance means that a thing gets hot. When current flows through it, it gets hot. Now every hot thing should be able to shed that heat and cool down. A speaker coil does that by moving when you have some air going through the coil and at the same time transferring that heat via air into the actual motor structure, the cone, the dust cap. That's why on big subwoofers you can see SPL guys, they're touching the dust cap and kind of feeling how hot the speaker is. Different speakers, depending on their construction, will have some kind of a cooling mechanism, how they effectively can cool. Some will have holes in the former, some will have an open vent pole where air can go in and out, some will have specific designs of the motor that allows the airflow to cool the coil down. Now, the problem is that if you would put too much current into this coil, it's gonna heat up too much, up to a point where the speaker itself cannot dissipate that heat, and then the heat is building up and it's gonna heat up even more and more, up to a point when the glue that is used for these wires is gonna start melting, smoking, and eventually you will have a fail in the coil where the wire will burn. And this is typically what happens when you literally burn a speaker. You burn the coil and there's no continuity and the speaker basically stops working. The smoking that you have when you blow a speaker is not the actual wire, but the coating of the copper wire or the glue that is used to glue this wire to the former. So the question is now, what are the ways for us to feed way too much power into this coil than it can actually handle? So first of all, obviously, is just listening too loud, or should I say, wanting the speaker to give you more volume that it can reproduce. And when it's not enough, you're trying to push it, and then it's just way too much power for that speaker. What you can do instead is have higher sensitivity speakers, higher power handling speakers, or just to have more speakers. When you have a clipped signal, in reality, you're pushing much more power than you think that you do. And another thing, when you're pushing too much power and the driver is reaching excursion limits, it does spend way too much time in the extremities, that is, with the cone all the way out, or with the coil all the way in. So it's exactly the same with clipped power as well, because clipped signal, it's not a nice sine wave, but it goes up, then it has a flat top, it goes down, it has a flat bottom. And since our speaker is following the electric signal, what is happening with a physical cone is very similar what is happening with a sine wave. So when the sine wave goes up, the cone moves up. And then when the sine wave is clipped and you have a flat top, the speaker still stays at the very top. And only when the sine wave goes down, that speaker goes down. That means that instead of a speaker moving back and forth, it spends too much time in one extremity, then it moves, stays there, then it moves, stays there, rather than constantly moving. While the speaker is not moving, it doesn't move any air, it doesn't cool, and the heat builds up even more. Something similar happens when you're pushing a lot of power into a speaker that is not physically moving. We know that in ported enclosures, the cone at the port tuning frequency stays still and it moves a lot above the tuning frequency. So for example, if you have a subwoofer tuned at 33 Hz and you're playing 33 Hz tone, that cone is barely moving. However, you're pushing a lot of power into that coil. And since the speaker is not moving, it cannot cool down effectively. So you have to be careful how much power you're pushing. Now, in regards to speakers handling so much power, and I'm putting 300 watts on my mid bass, I'm putting 100 watts on my tweeter, that has to do more with the headroom in the amplifier rather than how much the actual speaker can handle. Pink noise, that represents music more than white noise, has a very interesting power characteristic. With white noise, you will have exactly the same amount of energy at every frequency. With pink noise, if you start at 20 Hz, one octave up, the energy drops by 3 dB. So at 10-15 kilohertz, you basically don't have any energy. So the power distribution is very different, and it's not that the speakers receive exactly the same energy at all frequencies. This is why setting gains at 1 kilohertz, I don't understand the setting gains thing. I never set gains on my amplifiers, and I don't understand that. Like, if it's not loud enough for you, yeah, turn the gains up, have more output. But when you're setting the gains of the amplifier, for example, you're setting for this mid-range 1000 Hz and using a sine tone. Sine tone is exactly the same as white noise. That means that that is 0 dB. If you're setting gains for your amplifier that does like 100 watts, it's gonna be way overkill for any mid-range or tweeter. It's not needed. Typical mid-ranges will have a sensitivity of, I don't know, 85 up to 90 plus dB. So imagine two mid-ranges that have sensitivity of 90 dB. One of them has 90 dB. You add a second one and you're doubling power. So you're adding plus 6 dB. So you have already 96 decibels of output with one single watt into each speaker. So 2 watts total. You don't need 100 watts of power, and this coil will never ever handle that much unless, I don't know, put some water cooling in the motor, like liquid cooling PCs. Maybe then you can take away all that heat, because speakers are very, very inefficient. They convert only, I don't know, maybe like 1% of energy that you're sending via these wires. They convert only 1% into acoustical energy. Everything else is heat. They're like super inefficient incandescent light bulbs. So coming back to that, my speaker can handle this and that. That is on transients. As I mentioned, coil is a piece of wire that has a resistance. If you connect this coil, for example, to a 12-volt battery, it's not gonna burst into flames the second you do it. It's gonna heat up, it's gonna get red, and then it's gonna burn. So it takes time. How much time it takes, it depends on the coil and how much energy you're pushing. So if you have this mid-range that can handle 30 watts, and if you have one very sharp transient that's like, I don't know, 50 or 70 watts, it can push out the cone, so it might rip the surround, or it might rip the spider, or maybe cause the coil slap, but it's not going to burn the coil if it's just one quick transient, one hit, because in that amount of time that it takes for kick drum to kick or whatever, the coil absorbs that heat, and on the quieter passages, when there's no drum hits or anything, it dissipates that heat. So on transients, it's very different compared to a single sine tone, for example, on a burp. But even burps, if you're not familiar, in SPL, when they want a higher score, they play only one single sine tone and they crank it up as much as they can. And that's when even a subwoofer that is rated like 1,000 watts can take 4,000 or 5,000 watts, because it's a very short duration of time. And that coil, it heats up, but it's not enough time for it to melt. If you would keep that same power for longer, for like 3, 4, 5 seconds, obviously the coil is gonna burn. But if it's just a second, turn on and off, it just heats up and dissipates it. So technically you can push much more than rated power into any speaker. The main question is, for how long? How much time do you have for the coil to absorb that heat without actually burning? So there you have it. 2 ways how to burn a speaker, and it all comes down to power and incorrect crossovers. So in order to avoid any damage to your speakers, set correct crossovers and be sensible with power. Use only what you need. Don't set your gains for the mids and tweeds up to clipping. It is not necessarily, unless you have, I don't know, 10-20 watt amplifier, then maybe. But if you have loads of power on tap, just why? I would never understand this. And then everybody's complaining, oh, I have this, I have this, I have that. Just use your common sense, people. So that's it. This was one of the videos where I'm blabbing without really showing anything. I do get some comments that people don't like this type of content, but I hope that for some, it's gonna be useful. So that's it. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next one.